Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us as we are winding down our summer conference. I hope that you have been enjoying the selections as we come into the final 2 days and leading up to our keynote address tomorrow by Tim LaSalle. Looking forward to that. So it's good to see everyone. And some of you are returnees. Had a chance to have you in other workshops, so welcome back, welcome back. Tonight's presentation will be Farm to Institution. We have a wonderful presentation with a panel discussion. Our moderators today, my name is Anna Muhammad. I'm the Equity Director for NOFA Mass, so I'll serve as your host. But the moderators for this, Hannah Leighton and Tanya Tervonsky, will be the moderators. And like I said, we have a wonderful selection of a presentation and a panel discussion. This is Farm to Institution 101. This session will provide an overview of the institutional market in New England, highlight existing and emerging opportunities for regional producers, to connect with institutions and discuss the impacts COVID-19 has had on these markets. And we know it's had a tremendous impact. This session will include a panel discussion with stakeholders working across the farm to institution supply chain, including food service directors, farmers, distributors, and support agencies. Now, before we get into this very timely discussion, I just want to give a few housekeeping items for today. And I'll start sharing my screen on that note so you can see some of the things some of the small housekeeping things we want to go over. First of all, we'd like to thank our sponsors for both the workshops and the overall conference. You're looking at some of our gold sponsors. They have been very, very generous in helping us and supportive. So when you have a chance, please support them, go through the program book, go to their websites and give them that support that they're giving us. You're looking at some of our silver sponsors at this point. They are also very generous with their support of NOFA Mass and this conference. We are presenting, attending, and hosting this workshop from land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a look at this map to find your location and the tribe that was here before we all came. For example, I am broadcasting from Springfield, Massachusetts, which was once the Potomac land and still is. And that ranged from Deerfield all the way down to Enfield, Connecticut. So if you want, I will put this link in the chat so that you can see what First Nations people were in this area before colonization. And we just like to pay homage to those people. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Hannah and Tanya and let them take it away. If you experience any technical issues, I'll be on mute, but just chat, put it in the chat and I will get to your questions and assist you. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the workshop, and Hannah, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Hannah Leighton. I'm the Research and Evaluation Manager at Farm to Institution New England. Welcome to this Farm to Institution 101 session. If you haven't already put a quick introduction into the chat box, we're really interested to know who's in the room and what your interest in Farm to Institution or your role in Farm to Institution looks like, so that we can make sure we're covering a wide range of topics today. I am going to kick us off today with some sort of foundational Farm to Institution information, and then hand it over to my colleague Tanya Tervonsky, who's going to lead us through a really great panel with some amazing folks, including Andy Cox, who is the dining director at Smith College, Nick Martinelli, who's the founder of Marty's Local, Mike Mayer, who is the owner of Poplar Hill Farm, and Tina White, program coordinator at Real Food Challenge. And to give you a sense of where we're going today, I'm going to spend the first 25 or 30 minutes outlining, giving an introduction to Farm to Institution New England, or FINE, as an organization, and outlining some of the nuts and bolts of Farm to Institution, with a very big caveat that we are in a state of transition, like many in the food system, in the Farm to Institution world. because of COVID-19, and things are changing very fast and every day. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the impacts that COVID has had on farm to institution supply chains and the work that we want to do. And we recognize that we're only just sort of beginning to understand what the future will hold for farm to institution. So we'll get into that in our panel as well. We'll hear from our panelists both about their experiences working with institutions and within the farm to institution sector before COVID, and also what the last several months have looked like and how they're imagining the future to look. And then we also will have some time to talk with all of you and hear your questions. So I welcome you to put any questions you have throughout the presentation into the chat box, and we'll be logging those, and we'll make sure that we get to everyone's questions, and then we'll have some time at the end to also talk about any challenges or experiences that you want to share, and we can kind of workshop and brainstorm some things together. So a quick introduction to FINE as an organization. FINE is a six-state network backbone organization dedicated to mobilizing the power of New England institutions to transform our food system. We've been around for about 9 years, and we were founded out of two conversations that were happening around the same time. One was with farm to school leaders in the region who were already doing a lot of work with K through 12 schools, but recognizing a need for a broader, more robust network that could work with hospitals and colleges and correctional facilities and other institutions. And at the same time, the New England Agricultural Commissioners were having conversations about strategies for keeping farmland in production in New England, and they had identified the institutional market as a key lever. And so FINE was born out of those conversations that were happening about almost 10 years ago. Through our core values, FINE envisions a New England where institutions are playing a critical role in building an equitable and just food system. And we imagine that food system provides access to healthy and abundant food for all New Englanders and is defined by sustainable and productive land and ocean ecosystems. So why do we think that institutions have the capacity to make that kind of impact? There are a number of reasons, which some of them are a little bit in flux. So you'll see that this first line of they provide a diverse and stable market, we've italicized and added an ish to stable to recognize just that things are changing right now. And that while we know that institutions do have large budgets and they feed a lot of people, we've seen in the last couple of months that they're also vulnerable during these times of crisis to disruption. That being said, we do know that institutions in the region have a huge purchasing power, and we're seeing that pre-COVID, schools, hospitals, and colleges were spending about 17% of their budgets on local food, and we consistently hear that they're interested in dedicating more of their budget dollars to local food. We're seeing now more than ever that institutions play a really important role as anchors in their communities that help to make sure that people are fed and housed. And again, this is a pre-COVID statistic, and so this has changed a little bit, but we know that about 3.7 million people are spending time in institutions every day in New England. And so a lot of institutions are still really focused, even though those people aren't on site every day, on making sure that their constituents have access to food. And so we really feel like for the institutional sector, with great power comes great responsibility. And we know that institutions with their incredible purchasing power and the number of people who rely on them for food have the opportunity to really contribute to a food system where all people have access to fresh and nutritious and affordable food, and also where we're encouraging and incentivizing sustainable and fair and equitable growing practices. And we, as I said, we work across the 6 New England states, and we focus on our regional scope for a couple of reasons. In New England, where the states are small and there's a shared history and culture, it lends itself really well to collaboration. And we also know that in this region where the northern states are producing more food and there are more consumers in the southern states, it's really helpful to look at the region as a food system. And we also know that a lot of the stakeholders that are supporting those relationships and working to move food are working across state lines. So let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of farm to institution and what we really are talking about when we talk about these markets. So FINE focuses on schools, colleges, hospitals, and most recently on correctional facilities. And there are 4,628 K-12 schools, 200 colleges with dining services, 256 hospitals, and 61 state and federal prisons in the 6 New England states, as well as 32,000 farms. Between schools, hospitals, and colleges, our data shows that they're spending about $1 billion on food and beverage annually. We are just starting to dig into this research in the correction sector, so we don't have those numbers, but you can see that just the 3 primary sectors that we focus on have this really big purchasing power in the region. Our research has shown that those 3 sectors are also spending about $166 million on local food annually, and that's defined differently across the different sectors. But we do consistently hear in our research and our surveys that institutions are trying to increase those numbers. And a little later on, I'll touch on some of the commitments and policies and motivators for increasing local procurement. So when we talk about working with institutions, and for farmers that are interested in breaking into that market or working with schools or hospitals or colleges, it's helpful to understand what the different operating structures are for institutions to know where there may be an opportunity to establish a relationship. So I'm going to touch just on 2 kind of broad buckets, the self-op institutions and institutions that are managed by a food service management company. So institutions that are self-op, all dining staff are employees of the institution, and procurement policies are determined by the institution itself. So if they want to set a goal around local procurement or sustainable food purchases, then that happens within the parameters of the institution. All of the revenue is generated and retained by the institution, and records are subject, if you're a public institution, to open record policies. If you're managed by a food service management company, then, and this is like your Sodexo's, Aramark, Compass, for example, Chartwell's, dining staff are employed by that food service provider, and the procurement policies and targets and KPIs are established within a contract that you develop between the institution and the food service management company. And those contracts can last between 5 and 15 years. So the language that goes into those contracts is really important. And a lot of the decisions around local procurement are made at a corporate level instead of at the site level. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, because while you may not have the same level of flexibility as working with the self-op, if a food service management company decides to make a commitment to local food and they're working with several institutions, then that can have a real ripple effect. And we're going to hear more from Andy and Tina both later on about some of the other differences between those 2 structures. So let's talk a little bit about how local food is moving through the supply chain. 3 distribution models that I wanted to touch on briefly. Broadline distributors, this is an institution's sort of first go-to source where they can get everything in the kitchen sink. So you might be getting your meat there, your toilet paper, your to-go boxes, your flour, and often there's a commitment for a total annual buy as well as categorical buy. So you might have a commitment to buying a certain amount of your meat there, for example. A secondary, and that would be, your Cisco's, US Foods, Gordon Food Service, those kinds of big companies. Secondary distributors often will supplement those purchases with fresh products, specialty products, last minute needs. A lot of local is moving through those secondary distributors, and we'll hear from Nick later on today at Marty's Local. This would also include your smaller distributors like Katsarubis, for example. And then we have direct purchases, which is another place where local often comes in. And it's often because of requirements at the institutional level around volume or distribution or like case pack. This is often for smaller or less frequent purchasing. We'll hear a little bit more about that from our panelists as well. And I do also want to mention food hubs as a really great opportunity to connect with institutions. If you're a small or medium-sized local farm, they offer a really unique value proposition where they're often, the distribution is coupled with other services. Food hubs often can aggregate products in smaller quantities from multiple farms and then distribute as if it were one order. And farms are really likely to control pricing in the food hub model. This is a photo of Farm Fresh Rhode Island, which is a food hub based in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And they have a platform where farms can sign on and create their own listings of products. They manage the inventory in real time. They set their own prices and they deliver to a warehouse where Farm Fresh Rhode Island staff aggregates the product, puts it on one invoice and delivers that product to K through 12 schools, hospitals, food pantries, colleges, as if it were ordered from one farm. So you get one order and one invoice. Other food hubs in our area, or we're really lucky in New England to have a lot of amazing food hubs doing work, but you might look into places like New Entry Sustainable Farming Project or the Worcester Regional Food Hub or Food Connects. And there's quite a bit of information on FIND's website about food hubs in New England. So I mentioned earlier that there are a handful of reasons why institutions might be looking to increase their local, good, real, sustainable food procurement. And so I wanted to touch on a couple of those commitments and policies that exist that that farmers and others along the supply chain might be interested to know in order to better understand the opportunities to build relationships within your state and the sort of frameworks that exist for the institutions in your area. So the first thing I want to touch on is public policy. So there are a number of state level policies that exist across the region that incentivize local food procurement for institutions. So the first one, first category is local preference laws. So in Massachusetts, for example, there's a local preference law that creates a price preference for agriculture products grown or produced from Massachusetts. Though most states actually have some kind of local preference law, the language around accountability and reporting is often very loose. So in Massachusetts, it says that this requires state agencies, colleges, and universities to use quote unquote reasonable efforts to purchase locally produced foods. Andy, maybe you'll share more about that, your experience as a Massachusetts buyer later on. But it also says that state agencies must purchase locally grown product if it's within 10% of the price of a product that was grown outside of Massachusetts. So for growers that are in Massachusetts looking to make those connections, it's really helpful to know that there's this state level policy that's incentivizing those purchases. In New York, there is reimbursement policy for K through 12 schools. It's been around, we're in the second year now. And it, as a K through 12 school, you receive federal and state reimbursements for financial reimbursements for every meal that you sell in the national, or that you provide in the National School Lunch Program. And in New York State, the state level reimbursement is 6 cents. It's been that way, I want to say like for 35 years or something. It's been static for a long time. And this policy states that for schools that purchase, that have 30% New York grown food on the plate, then they receive a 25-cent reimbursement per meal. So it's this huge financial incentive to be supporting New York grown farms. There is also new legislation that was just proposed called the Small Farm to School Act that would create a similar pilot program to incentivize public schools to work more closely with small and local farms. So there are some interesting programs that are being developed now. Farm to school programs are also often codified in state legislation. So in Vermont, for example, their state level policy that establishes the farm to school program and sets a 50% Vermont grown goal by 2025. It also creates a grant program for equipment and other expenses around local food. It mandates training and TA for food service programs, and it establishes a food systems coordinator position. And then finally, many states and also municipalities will have a food policy council, and these councils are designed to discuss and address key food systems issues. So in Rhode Island, for example, the Rhode Island Food Policy Council also has a farm to institution working group that is focused on making these connections. Your food policy councils are also a really great place to learn more about state level legislation that can incentivize or support you accessing institutional markets. And you also might want to look at places like the National Farm to School Network and the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, National Young Farmers Coalition, and NOFA to get more information on some of these policies. Within institutions themselves, and we'll talk about this much more later on when we introduce Tina, but I wanted to highlight three sort of standardizing bodies and institutional commitments that you may have heard about in your travels. And the first is the Center for Good Food Purchasing, Policy, which encourages large institutions to direct their buying power toward 5 core values, which are local economies, environmental sustainability, valued workforce, animal welfare, and nutrition. And this is primarily for cities and for municipalities and for K through 12 schools. And for the districts that they're working with, they provide a framework for benchmarking, tracking, evaluating, storytelling, and so on. Real Food Challenge works within a similar set of value categories and aims to shift $1 billion. Sorry if I'm saying things you're going to say later, Tina. Aims to shift $1 billion of existing university food budgets away from industrial farms and unhealthy food and towards food that's coming from that's local and community-based, that's fair, that's ecologically sound, and humane, and that's what they call real food. And the goal is to make that shift by 2020, and so we'll hear, I think, a little bit more from Tina later about what it means now that we're in 2020. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight that for hospitals, Healthcare Without Harm's Healthy Food and Healthcare program works with about 1,000 hospitals across North America and advocates and supports people and plant friendly food, healthy food in communities, and food policy action and advocacy. So together, these 3 groups make up another group called Anchors in Action. And as you're exploring opportunities to work with institutions, it's really helpful to understand if they have a commitment to one of these policies or sets of standards, and that can sort of help you understand where you fit in and what you can provide to institutions based on these standards. And then I mentioned earlier that if an institution is working with a food service management company, then you're often using contracts and requests for proposals to establish metrics and key performance indicators and goals. And so this is also a place where if an institution has made a commitment in their contract, then they are likely to be eager to establish relationships with local growers and producers that will help them get to those goals. And then a few funding opportunities that I wanted to highlight, and I think we're going to figure out how to share some links after this, so you'll get this information as well. But the first one is the New England Food Vision Prize, which is a $1 million annual prize that actually for 2020 is currently on, those projects are on hold as Henry P. Kendall sort of figures out what a COVID response is going to look like. But for the last couple of years, they have awarded $250,000 prizes to college campuses that are working with stakeholders across the supply chain. And the goal is to support innovative ideas among New England colleges and universities by increasing the amount of regionally produced food on campus menus. And our panelists are going to talk a little bit about one of those prizes later on, but this is also a really cool way as a grower or distributor to sort of get into a project to start the farm to institution process. I also wanted to share that I'm sure folks on this call are familiar, but there are a lot of USDA grants that are dedicated to getting farmers ready, either wholesale ready or working on food safety or insurance and so on. But there are also things like the Local Food Promotion Program, LFPP, which offers grants to expand local and regional food business enterprises. And a lot of schools and institutions will implement LFPP grant funded programs. And that's another opportunity to sort of bring stakeholders together from across the supply chain. And then I wanted to just say that there are some state level small farm grants that might not be explicitly about working with institutions. But for example, the Harold Grinspoon Foundation Local Farmers Awards, I'm not sure if anyone on this call is familiar, but they provide funding in Western Mass and Eastern New York with the goal of strengthening local farmers' ability to compete in the marketplace. So that's another opportunity for farmers to seek funding. So that was farm to institution then, and now here we are in 2020, and things are really changing and transitioning, and we don't know exactly what the future of farm to institution is going to look like, but we do know that we're seeing a lot of changes and a lot of challenges and also some opportunities. And so we wanted to touch on a couple of those things, and I'm just going to highlight two interesting case studies that we've seen from across the region where institutions are really kind of doubling down on local food. But I want to highlight a couple of the challenges that we've identified over the last several months. And again, I know we're gonna dive into this in more detail in a little bit. But from the institutional side, we've seen that colleges and K-12 schools have significantly reduced their capacity or closed altogether or shifted to grab and go options, while healthcare facilities are also seeing a reduced number of meals served based on not allowing visitors into their facilities or other limitations. We've seen that for K-12 schools that there's this real need to balance distribution with access and nutrition. So a lot of schools are thinking about how to do grab and go options and still make sure that that food is accessible to everybody, that you can access, that you can find fresh and hot food still, while making it easy for young people to pick up. In the correctional sector, I'm going to share one sort of positive example that we've seen, but largely we have heard from across the country that jails and prisons have, the quality of the food has continued to decrease during this time. We also know that because of this disruption in the supply chain, that we've seen a real surplus of farm products at the production level, while the demand on food banks and food pantries has increased. We know that COVID is having a disproportionate impact on communities of color up and down the food supply chain. And then from institutions, we've just consistently heard that planning for the unknown and these financial implications is really causing this shift in the role of institutions, and that it's just a kind of scary time for institutions right now. That being said, that shift for institutions, and I mentioned earlier this role of institutions as anchors in their community, we've seen a lot of really positive examples of cross-food system collaboration and communication, and instances of where relationships existed between local farms and K-12 schools and colleges, and there was already some dialogue happening, that it's been much easier to maintain consistent supply of food and grow those relationships, and also pivot so that they could support, so that colleges can support K through 12 schools or food banks, for example. And then we've also heard that, you know, again, really depending on what the reopening plans look like, that there is an opportunity to quote unquote rebuild better, and potentially increase the amount of local and higher quality food. And so I wanted to share two examples. The first is in the healthcare sector. There are a number of facilities that have CSA shares for their staff or for visitors, but it's mostly a way to provide access to fresh and healthy food for hospital staff. And so in New Hampshire at Concord Hospital, they have had for the last 4 or 5 years a CSA share with a local farm, and it's on demand, so you don't have to commit to it as a staff member, but they sell the shares weekly at cost. And I recently spoke to their food service director, who said that at the beginning of the pandemic, they were selling out of the normal amount of shares that they have within minutes, and that they've been able to actually increase the amount of shares that they can buy from a local producer by 30%. And they expect that that's actually going to carry over into whatever our new reality is, because they're seeing that frontline workers and hospital staff, that to be able to access this local and fresh food within their workplace is actually like a really great thing under normal circumstances. They've also opened a grocery store where they're selling local products for staff, including they're able to buy 100% of their beef locally, and they're also probably going to keep that grocery store open after COVID passes. Or it's hard to know what the rest of that sentence sounds like, but they're planning to make that a longer term offering because they're really seeing the value. And we've heard examples of that from other healthcare facilities as well. And then I wanted to share an example from the Maine Department of Corrections, who again is, you know, kind of perhaps an outlier in the corrections world in terms of the emphasis that a lot of their facilities are putting on buying local and nutritious and sustainable food. But as they were seeing this surplus of Maine potatoes at the beginning of the pandemic due to lack of food service markets for all the potato growers in Maine, they started working with the Department of Agriculture, and they were able to purchase 45,000 pounds of potatoes and sell them in their facilities. And so there are examples of institutions that are have really been able to pivot and support some of the disruption relief. So we'll figure out how to get this list of resources to you all, but you can see here that FINE has a resource database with over 300 reports and guides and toolkits and legislation. CISA has a wholesale tip sheet, which includes lots of resources for working with institutions. I invite you to check out Mass Farm to School and MDAR, as well as the Cornell Small Farms websites. They all have wholesale resource pages. Kitchen Table Consultants, who we have worked with in the past on a full day farm to institution farmer readiness training. They have a webinar workshop available online that's really informative. And then all of those pieces of legislation that I mentioned earlier are in our farm to institution state policy snapshots. So we welcome you to check some of these things out for more information. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to hand it over to Tanya, who is gonna kick off the panel portion of our day. Unless, Tanya, is there anything that's come out of the chat box that we want to address before that?
No, not yet. We haven't had any questions yet, but we would love to have this be as interactive a dialogue as possible. We're going to allow our panelists to introduce themselves and tell a little bit about their relationships, the work they've done together, the work they've been doing at their own businesses or organizations. But we also want to open it up to any questions that you have. And we're also interested in hearing your own experiences with Farm to Institution, either to share stories, to crowdsource ideas for challenges that you may have encountered, to ask questions of our panelists or of each other. So please use the chat box. Let us know what you'd like to hear about as well, and we'll make sure to try to cover all of that as best as we can. So that said, it's also helpful if you have a chance to introduce yourselves in the chat. Most of you have done that, but if you haven't, we'd love to hear where you're calling, what your name is, where you're calling from, and the farm or organization or business that you are part of. So briefly, my name is Tanya Taranovsky. I work for FINE. I'm a colleague of Hannah's. We work very closely together and also with the folks who are on the panel with us. We're thrilled that NOFA Mass has accepted us to come and speak with all of you. It's really great to be able to connect, especially these days. So we wish we were all in person, but this is the next best thing. So thanks for taking the time to join us. I'm the director of programs at FINE, and I work closely with the college campuses in our network. And so I'm going to now turn things over to allow each of our panelists to just take a moment to introduce themselves to you so that you can know who they are and the part of the supply chain that they represent. I would like to start with Tina White from Real Food Challenge. So Tina, can you unmute yourself and please introduce yourself and Real Food Challenge to the folks on the call?
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. And thank you all for being here today. My name is Tina, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the program coordinator with Real Food Challenge. And Real Food Challenge is an organization that works with youth in universities. They leverage the power that youth and universities have to build a more nourishing system for the earth, for producers, for eaters, as well as our communities. So this past decade, we've been supporting students that have been running campaigns to have their university commit to 20% real food by 2020. That's sort of the baseline that we've been working with. And we're at 2020 now. So a lot of my work has been around making sure that schools have the support to reach the goals that they are able to get to, and yeah, trying to, and now we're sort of in a transitioning point, but we are, Real Food Challenge is using like the expertise that we have built and our experiences from this past decade of campaign to support the Real Meals campaign, which I can link all of y'all in the chat box, but yeah, I'll stop there as far as my intro.
Thanks, Tina. Andy, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Andy Cox, he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Dining Services at Smith College in Northampton. I've been there just over 5 years. And when I got there, there were students organizing around Real Food Challenge. I came from a school that had signed the commitment to be at 20% by 2020. So I was familiar with it. And with the help of the students, we got the president of the college to commit to 20% by 2020 in 2016. So we had 4 years and we were at about 9% at that time. So we hit our goal early. We hit 26% in 2019. Still looking at 2020 numbers, which seem to have less volume, but I think higher percentage. And yeah, so we particularly focus on the local and community-based metric. There are sort of 4 criteria, and Tina can go into this, that make food qualify as real. So there's certified humane, certified fair, ecologically sound, and then the local and community-based. You obviously want to hit as many of those as possible. So we have certainly plenty of local farms that we work with that are both locally and community-based and certified organic. But I know organizations like NOFA, you don't need a USDA stamp necessarily, as long as you commit to the goals of NOFA and follow the organic practices And one of the things I really appreciate about the working with local farms is the sort of transparency. Like, I don't need you to go get a third-party certification for humane treatment of your animals when I can visit them myself, like I have with Mike. Yeah, so we are continuing to increase our percentage, although the total volume is going to go way down. Smith just announced on Wednesday that we are not inviting students back for the fall. So still sort of figuring out what that means for us.
Thanks, Sandy. Appreciate you joining us too when we know that things are happening fast and furious on the college front. So appreciate that. Mike, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tanya. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Mahar. I own and operate Poplar Hill Farm with my brother and father. We raise all natural pasture-raised beef, and we've been working with Smith College for about 2 years now in some capacity. We started with just extra ground meat from animals that were also staying local right in Northampton, where Smith is located. And that has grown into sending 15 beef this past winter.
Great, thanks. And last but not least, Nick Martinelli, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to everyone.
Thanks, Tanya. I'm Nick Martinelli. I own and operate Marty's Local. We are a food distributor specializing in local and regional foods. We started 5 years ago, and we offer foods from about 70 plus local and regional farms, primarily in Western Massachusetts, also in the Hudson Valley of New York and Vermont, and some foods from farther afield as well. And we're really cut in the, or built in the mold of a food hub with the goal of increasing the local and regional purchasing, trying to make it simpler for folks like Andy at Smith, or grocery stores or restaurants or caterers to access the real incredible array and volume of local and regional foods that are high quality, that are available in our region. So that's what we're doing.
Thanks so much. We're really thrilled that you are all joining us today to share your perspectives on farm to institution. And I invite all of you that are on the call at any point in time to let us know, raise your hand, or if you're not on video and don't want to be on video, that is not a problem. You can type your question into chat or just flag that you have one for any of our speakers at any time. We'd love to hear from you. But I would like, in the meantime, to ask our panelists, like each of you we're gonna sort of start with the big picture here a little bit about farm to institution, and then we're gonna get into some more of the specifics of how that looks from your perspective. But I would love to hear from each of you what you really envision as institutional supply chains being what is the role that they play in building a more equitable and just food system? This is the mission-based question, right? So how is it that you see, from your perspective in the supply chain, that farm to institution can make real meaningful change? Any one of you feel free to chime in first. Otherwise, I'll call on you. We're going to start with the farmer. Actually, no, Tina, I'm sorry. I talked over you. Go ahead. Let's go ahead with Tina. Thank you, Tina.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to give just like a quick snapshot of the higher ed sector. At least that's the sector that Real Food Challenge works with. And we work with a lot of different values about the food system. So Hannah listed the four that we work with: local, community-based, fair, ecologically sound, and humane. So those are the types of foods that we that we work with colleges and universities to help improve their sourcing on. So especially with the local and community-based category, we aren't just looking at distance, we also have a value around there of the producers who are like bringing products to the universities to be embedded in the community and to have a stake in its health. And I think that's really important because that means that like the producers and the distributors and the institutions that are all like doing this work are challenging corporate consolidation in our food system, which like is a pretty huge barrier to making sure that our food system is actually equitable and just and resilient. So I think that that's one way that like organizations and the folks that we support in our network are trying to build towards this like new vision of a food system. And I think another thing that could expand the scope of that is also like with the uprisings around police brutality and how racial injustice is kind of bringing or brought to the forefront of our nation's like collective like sphere. I think folks are also like very much prioritizing producers who have been disenfranchised in the past, especially women and Black and Indigenous producers, as well as producers of color. So I think that's one way that like the values are starting to show itself in what we actually mean by when we say like equitable and just food system. So yeah.
Thanks, Tina. Okay, Mike, now we're going to go to you. You've had some time to think about it.
So I think what it means for me, or when we started about 5 years ago and decided to expand and expand our herd and looking for new customers and things like that, we have a little bit of a unique situation that our farm abuts land that's owned by a college, Smith College, and our animals actually graze on it. So the idea is kind of already there that maybe if we're selling meat, it should be going to Smith College where, the animals are on their own land, where the students see them and, et cetera. So I just think it's really important overall because typically, this is the only situation I could possibly think of where the students wouldn't be coming back. But typically an institution and hospitals and things like that, they're always running, they're always there. Trying to sell meat to restaurants is very difficult because running a restaurant is very difficult. They're up and down and I think everything that was talked about earlier, everything is much more stable. And for a farmer, that's really very important. It gets harder every single year to keep doing this with rising costs, but not only that, but global warming, and we seem to don't have regular weather patterns anymore. It's one extreme or the other. So to have something that's there, that's stable, pretty steady all the time is very important.
Yeah, I'd be happy to go.
Mike, I'm going to keep you on for 1 second, and because I just want to follow on from a quick question and give you a chance to address that. So
Sure.
Dale noted that and Andy, you might be able to help with this too, that they believe that, or she believes that pesticides are used in the lawn care at Smith. Is this something that you're aware of or that you've been able to deal with somehow?
Yeah, I think they do on center campus, right? So we're talking up in Whately. It's a field station that they own that they are managing the meadows like that, like they do Chapin Lawn or Sealy Lawn, this palatial green. I mean, I'll be honest, the new AVP for facilities and grounds is aware of it and is working on reducing those numbers, but this isn't the land. Like, they're not grazing in the middle of campus.
No, exactly.
Thanks for addressing that. I think it's important to make sure that
Sure.
we're answering the questions too as they come up. We have a few coming in, so we're going to give Nick the floor for a moment here to share his perspective on how distributors and the middle of the supply chain is really key also into moving the food system into a new place. Nick?
Yeah, thanks. So I think in terms of the role that we play and how it fits into increasing the idea that, or it bringing it closer to a just and equitable food system, one of the things that I think distinguishes a regional distributor from a national distributor is that at its best, and this is the case for most of our relationships, is that there are relationships with our farm partners. So we know almost all of them, if not all of them, in a personal sense, that we've visited the farms, we visited their production facility. There's a baseline human element to it that coexists with the business aspect of it. And at its best, we're asking the farmer for the price that works for them. So this gets to the sort of equitable side of it. It's not the traditional capitalist model where you drive the price down to the bottom, and because you have the purchasing power to do that as a big entity, it's quite a different model from that. We're saying, what price would you like to sell it at? And then we work our margin on that and to talk to the customer and say, what price, does this price work for you? And, that's getting down to brass tacks, but that's, I think, in my opinion, one of the ways that a regional distributor with a mission of building a regional food system like our business has is contributing to that. And I know of other businesses like ours that are that exist in New England, both for-profit and nonprofit, that are running in this same direction, and it's encouraging to see.
Thank you, Nick. And Andy?
Thanks. Yeah, I feel like I'm sort of given this gift of all of this institutional money that it's my personal imperative to shift out of the institutional supply chain. So yeah, I love the fact that I get to know my farmers and understand their operations, and we're all sort of working together. We spent, I think, about $375,000 in the 4 counties of Western Mass in FY 2019, and that's more than doubled in 4 years. And that dollar spent in our own backyard to, with farms who are taking care of the land in our valley, will have like an economic impact to it, right? So that dollar will then be spent again. I think the metric is 2.4 times, right? So every dollar that Smith spends in its own community has a greater impact than just that dollar spent. And I think when we take the time to reward farmers for, taking care of that land in our backyard, I mean, we want the whole valley to thrive. And it's just sort of my goal to shift as much of it as possible to those local economies.
Thanks, Andy. Andy, while you have the floor, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about the relationship with Poplar Hill, because we've talked about the big picture now, but I'd really like to have people hear a little bit from you about how that relationship developed, how it works for each of you. So Mike, you're up next too. And so yeah, and where you feel that how you feel that that's evolved over time.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief, but there's a lot to the evolving institutional purchasing story. So at 9%, we had sort of crossed a lot of the easier things off the list, like local apples and local dairy, and seasonal lettuce, right? So getting more of your budget to be shifted to local foods, you need to get things that grow outside of the typical New England growing season, either through season extension or processing or foods that are available year round, like dairy or meat. So as we kept increasing, it became more and more challenging to shift, or more expensive, or so there's a bunch of ways to sort of mitigate that, right? So you can build in processing in-house, right? So if you commit to I I don't know, the processing of the vegetables in-house as opposed to buying like a pre-cut carrot stick. A lot of farms aren't selling carrot sticks, right? So like you have to be able to process that in-house. So like you design your schedules and your plan around maximizing the staff and the training to be able to do that in-house. Or you sort of increase your volume of purchasing. I increased our total shiitake purchase so that I could work with Mycoterra. They were able to like meet me halfway price difference between what I was paying and what they were selling it by me almost doubling how many shiitakes I used. So, there's a room to negotiate there too. And then in the case of the whole animals we're buying from Poplar Hill, we basically said we need to buy the whole animal to make it economically feasible. So, but we also needed to go in with other schools to really increase our volume on that. So we actually worked with Westfield State, Mount Holyoke, and Amherst College, and we put together this grant proposal, and we got a New England Food Vision Prize, a $250,000 prize to basically put in the infrastructure to house this, right? So like meat still has some seasonality to it, but you can freeze it. And so we worked with Adams Farm up in Athol to sort of take advantage of their down season. So like we were upfront with farmers, like we need you to keep your animals on hay past, winter. You're going to have to process in late January, February, and March, because those are the times where Adams can give us a break on slaughter pricing and the volumes that we're going through. We committed to 100 steers and 300 hogs from 12 different farms. It was a New England Food Vision Prize. We did extend it to 30 miles into New York. So there are a couple of New York farms who are part of it as well. But we said you had to send at least 10 animals at a time, because it's a lot to manage all of the different processing dates and the cut sheets and all of that. So we ended up buying 71 tons of meat, which when there was a pandemic and meat shortages and meat spikes, we were all set. And so we wound up putting in large freezers and getting a vehicle to distribute around campus. We did hire a farmer from Connecticut to help consult on animal welfare and farm practices. And it's been successful. We're uncertain what our volumes will be next year, so we haven't made any further commitments beyond that. But the goal is to increase it to 90, 100% of our meat coming from these local farms.
Thanks, Andy. I just want to take a moment to emphasize a couple of the things that you talked about, because I know that for folks who are trying to enter the institutional supply chain, pushback is often on the cost of local food. And you've brought up a couple of ways that you as a dining director have been able to really work with farmers to figure out ways to address that. The whole animal approach is a great one. And it takes a little creativity on the side of the dining director to think about using that whole animal. But you've also brought up how you partnered with other institutions to be able to really make that work. And so I think my sort of summary and advice to folks is not to give up, but to really continue having a dialogue about what your needs are and understand what the needs are of the institution, and really continue to look at creative ways to meet both of those needs. And Marty, you've talked a little bit about that too in terms of the pricing side as a distributor. I'm going to have you jump in on that in a sec, but I want to give Mike a chance to talk a little bit from his perspective about what having institutional buyers means to you as a farmer, and what are some of the big benefits of working with a college like Smith and working with Andy or other institutions that you might sell to?
Great, and to just piggyback on kind of what you said, for another farmer, if you think maybe you are too small or you can't, jump into the fold that quickly, I would advise trying to find a farm to work with that already is working with an institution or something along those lines. Where right now I have 2 other farms that work with us because they're just small, kind of, I don't want to say hobby farming, but they both have full-time jobs and they farm on the side, and they have a small herd. We buy animals from them. They follow the same practices we do. So they're almost like a satellite operation from us. It allows them to have an income you know, it's almost a real trickle down effect from the institution where I'm getting paid and then that money is being spread around. So definitely if you're a small farmer, you think you can't get in, you know, there's ways to do it for sure. And that leads into the best thing about the institution, back to this, you know, the stability of it, is having that income in a time of year, like Andy said, Adams is slow. That's the slaughterhouse, is slow in the winter months, and that's obviously when it would be slow for me. People aren't exactly out grilling and things in January, so it's nice to have income, you know, year round like that. It also helps me kickstart my season every spring, where I have to, you know, get corn in the ground, and my bills are the highest in April and May, and typically, you know, there's no income for January, February, and March. So this has definitely changed our overall operation, how we're able to operate. And that stability also allows me to take a lot more chances on, you know, other opportunities that normally I wouldn't feel comfortable with.
Thank you, Mike. Nick, I'd love to have you jump in here a little bit too, and talk a little bit about sort of the view of all of this from the distributor's perspective. I think that you probably have a lot of, working with a large number of local farms, you probably have some advice too for those who are looking to get into the institutional market or to grow the institutional market that they may already have started working with.
Sure. Yeah, what we've found, our experience has been over the last 5 years, that there are a lot of different sizes that are going to work, whether it's produce or dairy, even really small dairy, grains and flours, specialty products, a lot of different sized businesses that can still work with us and work with an institution, whether it's directly with the institution or with a distributor. What we're looking for when we build those relationships is, number one, that the people, the processes, the product, that there's integrity there in all three. And that's, you know, we find out about that through talking directly with them, through talking with the folks that have already been working with them, and then, you know, trying out the relationship, and then for those folks to be able to have, you know, really excellent communication is really helpful for us. We know that things may be available, but that kind of heads up on that is really critical for us, because we're then communicating through to the end customer, as opposed to showing up and learning on the spot. And those are some of the key elements for us as we look at those relationships.
That's a great, thank you. Tina, I would love to also have you weigh in a little bit, because I know Real Food Challenge has a number of resources available to farmers and producers as well. So can you share a little bit about that and contribute that?
Yeah, so with Real Food Challenge, I guess we really see like our role in this farm to institution work to make sure that like the students that have the energy and care about like these values are supported in making sure that like the institution puts their money where their mouth is. So we've along with supporting students in their campaign to make commitments around community-based producers, we also have created a tool called the Real Food Calculator that helps to track, I guess, like institutions' food purchasing, and that's where that real food percentage that Andy was talking about, that's where that comes from. And this is to just make sure that like there's transparency and accountability around the commitments that were made. And in the calculator, we have developed a real food database, which gathers all of the products that institutions have bought that count as real, and puts it all into one database, like a search engine. And although we are sourcing this from products that have been researched by students, and that institutions are already buying, like we're definitely open to including producers that want to sell to institutions, that want to put their name in this search engine, so that so that it shows to the institutions that are looking for real food. So that's one resource that we have that's specifically for producers that y'all might be interested in. And I also think that we also have a set of guidelines that are called the Real Food Standards that I guess kind of say or define what local and community-based means for us. So right now we have criteria around distance, size, and ownership on what food products count as local and community-based, but we are also starting this really exciting collaboration with the two other organizations that Hannah listed in her presentation, the Center for Good Food Purchasing and Healthcare Without Harm. We're going in on a collaborative process to update our standards altogether, so that across all of our 3 different sectors, from higher ed to municipalities to hospitals, that we have the same set of guidelines that says like what our networks can count as like local and community based. So we think that this is a really exciting way that we can support producers, so that it provides like these institutions like opportunities to like collaborate and to support producers like y'all that are trying to sell to them.
Thank you, Tina. I want to turn things around into some of the questions that have been brought up in the chat so far. There were a couple comments that Heather Kent that you have in there. One about bringing food from the school gardens into the school, and I believe also about working with your food service management company to focus in on local food and the dining in the dining services. And we have folks here who are happy to talk about that. But I'd love for you to actually put those questions in your own words to our speakers, or direct them to anyone in particular if you're able to unmute yourself. I'll give you a sec if you can, if you want to do.
I am. Thank you, Tanya. Just very quickly, I was actually brought into the school as somebody to oversee the new gardens that they had, with the assumption that we were going to be able to use some of that produce in our food services. And then I was to learn that Sodexo has a very strict guideline as far as how we bring those foods in. And we started those conversations last year, because this was something that started last year. And I think that probably the vision was maybe over a 3 or 4 year period to actually work through everything so we could find our way into that. Also, we're very fortunate. We have a lot of local farms in our area. We have Appleton Farms, which is beautiful. And I know that I've talked with the farmer there, Andrew, who would love to see, very similar to what we're having a conversation about now, if we could bring some of his beautiful produce into our food services as well. So I tried to open the door in that conversation. Sodexo has been wonderful about having the conversation, but there's a lot involved as far as getting our kitchen prepared so that we could actually bring our food up to standard in their eyes. And that's kind of tricky. But then on the flip side of that, I would love to have a conversation to see if we could bring in, I know I've talked to the chef, and he would be very interested in bringing in some of the produce that they have at Appleton Farm as well. So if somebody could share with me maybe a great way to have those conversations, not only with Sodexo, because that's it's a little outside of my role within the program, but I'd love to learn how to have that conversation a little bit with the administration, who's very open and would probably be very welcome to that kind of conversation. I'd like some great wording and dialogue to be had, maybe a couple of resources I could explore to give me some firearms behind me.
Lots of great questions in there. Heather, can you also tell us where, which school you're working for and where it's located?
Yes, the school I'm working for is the Pingree School. They're a very progressive, very sustainably oriented program there, and it's a little bit north of Boston in South Hamilton, Massachusetts.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. That context is helpful. Andy, do you mind if I put you on the spot to start answering some of those questions for Heather?
Not at all. So I used to work for Sodexo. I have been to the Pingree School. I was a Northeast sustainability, we had a working group, and I was at the Hotchkiss School, and we had a very large farm that we also used something called the Sodexo School Garden Checklist. I put a link to one that somehow made it publicly on the web. They do have a process for allowing you to use food grown on campus. It is based around food safety, but we had a 280-acre farm at Hotchkiss that we raised animals that we also processed and used in the dining services. So there are ways to do it. I would say your number one thing you want to do is figure out who signs the contract with Sodexo and become their best friend over the period of time it is now till the contract ends, and utilize some of the fine resources on how to get like the language, the best language in the contract so that you have the leverage. I had a really savvy client who was surprisingly not in a business office. So usually contracts for food service management companies are signed by like the CFO or the controller or somebody in the business office. So Hotchkiss, they had an assistant head of school and director of environmental initiatives, and he had put in some serious levers for me to be able to sort of use them against Sodexo's supply chain, because you pretty much have to buy from an approved vendor when you're working with a large food service management company. And the barriers for farms to become approved are pretty high. It's usually like at least 5 million in insurance, obviously GAP certification. But that's sort of why I like the distributor model too. It becomes a little bit easier when you find a distributor that's already approved and that is willing to pick up the food for you. So if Marty's Local is already approved and you want this farm to work with them, it's sometimes like a backdoor to get the farm that you want into the system. I know I did that several times with a Red Barn, which was a little produce company in the Hudson Valley that happened to be approved for a nursing home in New York State that was willing to work directly with me as like a partner to get the farms I wanted in. I'm happy to talk offline. I've got all sorts of loopholes, which is probably why I'm not working for Sodexo anymore. But it can be a real challenge, and I admire your work, and there is hope. There's also some other Sodexos who are successful at it that I could probably put you in touch with. I know the folks at UVM really well, and they do a great job of working with distributors that are approved to get the food they need.
That's terrific. I can't thank you enough, and I might just get in touch with you. Thank you.
Heather, I also suggest that you check out what's happening in Springfield. They've done some really amazing work out there too, and a good point of contact and a real powerhouse in moving things forward is Liz Ogilvie of the Food Policy Council out there, who's helped the public schools in Springfield with Sodexo make some real movement. And she has a host of other contacts, dining directors and others that would be able to also offer some different perspectives and examples of how to make change. Nick, I'd love to invite you also to answer any parts of Heather's questions.
I think Andy had the most targeted responses possible, and we have not to date begun relationships with any food service management companies. We've been able to, even with those institutions that use them, we've been able to use the language in their contract that says if you can't get it through, we've been able to use language in the contract in order to service them, in order to provide produce or other foods to them in specific examples where they couldn't get it through whatever the food service management company was. So there are, I think looking carefully at that language, I think I'm reiterating what Andy said on that, But there are multiple ways to look to cut it, and I don't at this moment have advice about building or getting the initial contract with the food service management company, but rather the sort of the end around.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. I'll also note, as Hannah put in the chat, that FIND has a lot of, and Andy mentioned this too, but FIND has a lot of resources about how to make those contracts work for you if you're at an institution. And so I think that I just recommend that you take a look at what we have on our website around that, because there's a lot of helpful information. It's pretty weighty, there's a lot in there, but it's like that because the contract process is pretty dense. And so trying to break it down for people so they know how to make it work for them is what we tried to do. All right, we have a few other questions, but I might like to give the floor briefly to Tina, because working with food service management companies and self-ops and understanding sort of the pros and cons of each is something that Real Food Challenge has had to do a lot of. So Tina, do you want to weigh in a little bit on this?
Yeah, yeah, so I guess throughout the campaigns that students have run, we've done some research on the differences between how self-op and outsourced dining services operate. And I guess, so just to give you a quick landscape of what it looks like in higher ed, about 30% of institutions like colleges and universities are self-operated dining, while 70% are outsourced to third parties. And the biggest three are called Sodexo, Aramark, and Compass Group. Compass Group has two subsidiaries, Bon Appetit and Chartwell's. So I guess what this has been, mentioned already in this panel, but the outsourced dining companies do have preferred vendors list, and it is barriers for producers to become an approved vendor to sell, while self-ops sort of have more of the autonomy and making the decisions locally on who they vend with. And and I think that's probably the biggest difference too. We've also seen that because schools are able to make those decisions within themselves, they're able to engage students a little bit better in the process as well. They're not working with a third party headquartered somewhere else that makes more mass decisions about what food purchasing looks like. But yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of examples of how folks have gotten through loopholes around that, around this approved vendor barrier. And I think that working with I guess some examples in the Northeast that we've heard of, at Wesleyan College, the chef has a really great relationship with a farmer that is an approved vendor, and they're contracted with Bon Appetit. And something to note with Bon Appetit is that that company has a farm to fork program. So they actually have, I guess, some policy language to source from producers that are within 150 miles from where their campus is located and that have a revenue under $5 million. So I think that's one outsourced, I guess, or one food service management company that maybe producers might have an easier time working with. But I guess back to the Wesleyan story, this farmer in Connecticut, where Wesleyan is located, they are very well connected in the producer community there and are an approved vendor. So they sort of act as a middleman to gather surplus produce from different producers. I think Mike talked a little bit about how he does this with two of his other producers that he has relationships with. So it can definitely happen. So I think it's more of talking to the producers around you, sort of mapping out what institutions they're in relations with or talking to or having conversations with, and to sort of like strategize what's the best way to approach these institutions too. Because I guess I'm putting on my like campaigning and organizing hat as well, but numbers do make a difference. So if there's like a group of producers that approach an institution that really say like, we think that our products give your dining hall value, we're community based and we want to sell to you, like that can also like send a clear message as well. And I think, yeah, creativity and being connected to your community is ways that where the creativity can flourish on how to, I guess, get into that institutional market.
Tanya, could I add one comment?
Oh yeah, sure, Nick, go ahead.
Another really interesting example here is Andy's successor at Hotchkiss, Mike Webster, has a business called Torrey Hill Dining. So Sodexo was there. Torrey Hill Dining has since taken over the dining services contract. I don't know all the specifics of it, but the shift there to a greater emphasis on local purchasing, I think, which was already, as Andy described, pretty extensive, has been dramatic. And I think it's a really innovative model. There are people who have innovative models in a lot of the schools that we work with. And this one I just call attention to because I think it's, I haven't seen it elsewhere. And it may be something for folks to look further into. And I know that Mike Webster there is open to talking to people about what he's done and what's happening there as well.
Yeah, he absolutely is. And he's a great source of information for sure. And he's on a couple of webinars that Fine has. So you could also check out our YouTube channel for other webinars for that kind of content where folks dig into some examples from their perspectives and their experience. I want to also just take 1 minute to answer a question from Dale about whether food service management companies have incentives regarding social justice, Black or minority owned farms. And they do actually. And I want to be clear that there are very strong challenges in the way the systems are set up regarding values-based procurement, but most of these companies do have commitments, they're corporate commitments to these types of issues, and they also have some point people who are really dedicated to it, who are trying to make real change from within the companies, and then there are folks who are pushing from the outside to try to have more change. So there are some incentives. Unfortunately, some of the barriers counteract some of the incentives at times too. So I'm just going to kind of put that out there. And Hannah's answering a little bit more, and Hannah and Andy both also have a few more comments in the chat about that. But we are getting close to the end, and I want to make sure to give Joe a chance to answer his question. He had some questions about both how incredible this seasonality, the availability during different seasons is of New England food, but also that poses a particular challenge. And you yourself have some stories about trying to work into the institutional market. So Joe, feel free to ask your questions and let me know if there's anyone you want to direct it to.
Well, it seems to me from the discussion, I'm just a private citizen. I'm not a professional in food service, but my wife is in a nursing home, and I'm trying to encourage local seasonal produce. But there's no one to connect the company that sells for the whole year to the local farmers. Maybe a food council has to do something like that. There must be a secret that is successful in the Massachusetts, Connecticut area, but in Rochester area, there doesn't seem to be any initiative to connect the farm to institutions.
Yeah, sometimes it can be really hard to figure out who are the right people to go to. And this was brought up, I think, in a sense, in another question too. I believe, Dale, it might have been you asking about maps that really highlight the different nodes. We have some of that in the chat already, but Nick, you know, you're right there in the middle of the supply chain. I would love for you to take a moment to try to answer some of Joe's questions.
Sure. So in that particular area, I'm familiar with Headwater Food Hub. And Headwater Food Hub, I don't have a great deal of information to share about them other than that they're in that location and have a lot of partners, farm partners in that region, and perhaps could be a supplier to the elder care facility where your wife is. And if they have to build a relationship with the primary vendor there, then they probably would be willing to do that too. It's something that we have done in some instances, and we also do deliver. We've become a vendor to some elder care facilities in the region that we service. So that may be an avenue, the Headwater Food Hub or others. If there are others out there, I happen to know an individual there.
Thanks, Nick. Well, we're almost at the end of our time here, and I want to briefly thank all of you for joining us today and for lending really great questions and being part of this dialogue with us. Thank you also to our panelists, Andy Cox, Mike Mayer, Nick Martinelli, and Tina White. We've really enjoyed having you with us. Thank you, Hannah, for presenting, and thank you again to NOFA for having us here today. I would like to give Anna a chance again too. She's sharing some links in the chat, but perhaps you want to take a moment just to mention some of these in case folks aren't able to see them.
Sure. So as we are coming to the end of this wonderful workshop with such great information, I do want to take this time to express my thanks and gratitude to Tanya and Hannah, as well as our panelists for such an informative presentation. But I just put in some conference specific links that you can go to. Number one, just reminding folks, go to our vendors. The vendor link is there. That's in addition to the sponsors that you saw upon arrival in the workshop room. If you would like to donate to our Teacup rally, that money goes to pay for scholarships. We do have some of our youth attending this workshop this year, and they've been able to benefit from that scholarship. And lastly, if you'd like to evaluate this workshop, we love your comments so we can make it bigger and better. Next year, as you know, this is the first time NOFA has done this virtually, so we do appreciate your comments. And that link is there as well. And Tanya and Hannah, would you all, I know you had that slide that had some links to CISA and other entities. If you want to put that back up, and if you would like a copy of that slide, the videos are becoming available. For those of you who are participants, you should have gotten that notice in your email. You'll see it again, so you'll be able to get this slide. But if you would like to get these resources and more information, Tanya and Hannah just put their contact information in the chat. So Hannah and Tanya, do you have any closing remarks as we move into the to the conclusion of this excellent workshop?
Hannah, please.
No, thank you so much, Anna, for hosting us and for inviting us to join. And thank you to everybody on our panel and who attended. This was really appreciate all of your great questions and input in the chat box. And just please don't hesitate to reach out to Tanya or myself with any questions, or if you want to just have a follow-up conversation. We're always happy to chat.
Okay. And Tanya, did you have any closing remarks?
Just another thank you to everyone. Appreciated being able to join you. And I hope that this has left you with more information about Farm to Institution, as well as some ideas and inspiration for how to move forward on that in the arena that you work in. Thanks for joining us.
All right, all right.
And have a great weekend. Happy Friday.
Yes, happy Friday. And don't forget Tim LaSalle tomorrow night starting at 7 p.m. The link will be going out in your email. So please join us for our closing keynote address. Thank you all Have a great weekend, and hopefully it's cooled off in your neck of the woods.